unless you're a celebrity, especially, like a voice celebrity, you're probably not the best host to begin with. So it takes some reps. It takes some time. And you're right. I don't know if everyone factors that in and they give up after, 6 to 8 episodes and they're like, well, how come, I don't have the following that I expected? It's like anything. I mean, any musician starts with an audience of zero, with 0 followers. You have to build it kind of like one gig at a time as a musician would. So just knowing that there is kind of like that, I'd say 10 to 12 episodes at a minimum to hit your stride and recognize that you got to put in your reps.
That was Jared Johnson, founder of Shift Health and host of the award-winning podcast, Healthcare Rap. Jared joined me for the second of a 2-part crossover series where we discussed ways to launch a successful podcast and how to improve the one you've got. On part 1, I joined Jared on his show to chat about how content marketers can boost their success in launching a podcast. On this show, Jared and I take a look at how to improve the podcast you already have to attract more listeners and engagement. You're listening to What's My Tagline, a podcast focused on conversations around marketing, PR, social media, and more in the healthcare B2B space. I'm your host, Carol Flagg. Learn more about the show on the program page on healthcarenowradio.com, and be sure to follow me on Twitter at Carol Flagg or on LinkedIn. And now let's hear more from Jared Johnson as we discuss the top 10 ways for improving your podcast. Well, Jared, welcome back to What's My Tagline. I'm so excited to be talking with you again on this 2-part crossover podcast series that we're doing. I don't know if you can call it a series if there's only 2 of them, but maybe we'll do more in our future and it will be a series.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, Carol. This is going to be fun.
So I gave our listening audience a taste of what we were talking about today in my intro. But before we begin our conversation about the 10 things that you should be doing if you're already hosting and doing a podcast on your own, as you know, all of my guests, because I asked them, if you had to describe yourself as a tagline, what would it be?
Ooh, Carol, this is one of those questions that really makes you think deep. And I think I'm going to go a little meta on this, if we don't mind here for a moment. But I just got back from canoeing a portion of the Colorado River, and I didn't have cell reception at all for a couple of days. And so it really made me kind of back out again. It was a good time to just get away from work and everyone who wants to reach me, and all the things I think I have to do every day. So I think my tagline today is different than it would have been even a couple of weeks ago. But I'd say it is make every moment count. Yeah. I think even those moments that are away from sitting in front of a couple of monitors, having the phone right next to us, being so connected to everything. Instead, I got to spend some time with my son and our youth group with our church, and we were able to spend some time. It was 114 degrees outside.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
But the water temperature was in the mid 50s. And so you had this, the wind was blowing hard, you were paddling. So it wasn't necessarily comfortable, but it was a blast. It was so fun. And it was great to just get away for a little bit and just help you realize why we put all this effort into our work from day to day, is so we have moments like that.
Yeah. As a fellow Arizonan, I totally get how it could be that hot, the time of year that we're here, and just getting off that little bit of the grid, right? Like you said, just not being connected. I think that, I think we all sort of wish wish we all had a couple of days like that for sure.
100%.
So I'm going to start with tip number. These aren't really tips, but number 1 on our list, I suppose, and which is basically, for lack of a better analogy, it's the 3-legged stool of a successful podcast, and that is having an engaging host or hosts with a unique point of view. It needs to be well produced, and it has to be content that the audience that your intent is to listen to it, that they want to hear it. So I'm going to start in, and I'm going to talk about the fact that we run across podcasts all the time that have a host or hosts that don't really bring a unique point of view to the podcast listening landscape. It may be things that maybe it's not things that everybody's talking about, because you can still do a successful podcast about, topics that people are talking about, but there's no unique point of view. It's more focused in on perhaps the company messaging versus that host as a personality and what that host has to share and say and what that host thinks, which is why the audience tunes in. And of course, the well-produced aspect of it. We do hear podcasts, both of us, from companies who maybe take a webinar and they recut it, re-edit it to make a podcast. It hardly ever works. I've actually never heard one that worked well, or they don't have, good quality headsets or equipments, or people are calling in the cell phones and they've got phones ringing and their computers aren't turned off so you can hear their email dinging. All those, I think, make sense. And then lastly, of course, is you just want to produce content that people want to hear. Usually that is, I would say, educational in nature versus, product placement and about the products of your company.
Yeah, I really like the way you break that out, because I used to think, if you asked me maybe a couple of years ago, I would have said the three legs are the host, well produced, and then the topic. And I think the host and the topic can kind of go together, because that all has to do with the unique point of view. That's really the part that it has to do with. And we've all known examples of an engaging host, but the point of view is just it's so generic, right, that there's no reason to stick with that show over somebody else. And then we've all heard the ones that are okay, like decently produced. And we're just talking about the quality of the audio, and we're talking about the quality of the segments, and even the frequency, the consistency is probably a better word to say. That all has to do with how you're produced. But yeah, the audience, I love that. That's one of the legs of this stool, because you have to find the audience that you're trying to connect with. And that's really where everything comes to fruition here.
Right. And leading into that, sort of into topic number 2, is something that I think is lost on some of the podcast shows that I listen to, which is not remembering that this is entertainment and theater, that the person listening on the other end, probably has earbuds in, they're probably on a smartphone, they're probably on Apple Podcast, but the reality is that it is a theater-like experience. It's not a webinar. It's not a speaking engagement at a conference. It is entertainment and theater, and you have to remember that.
Yeah, that's a great point, Carol. When you talk about really realizing what this is, you are at the end of the day trying to command someone's attention, and that does mean this is entertainment and theater. To your point, I think where we don't really give much thought is that a lot, I'd say the majority of those who do end up launching a podcast run out of guests or topics a lot sooner than they expect. And so, that's part of your planning. Like what's your goal in it? Is it something you want to play out where you're providing thought leadership? Are you trying to generate demand in a product or service? And if so, do you realize how much time that takes? How much runway you need, how many episodes you need, and how different it needs to be. It is not hard anymore to find guests who are willing to be on a podcast. It used to be kind of a smaller group of people who understood what that meant. Now it seems like, for the most part, you can find a lot more people who have either been on one before or they're happy to do it. So that's not a differentiation point anymore, getting a certain person as your guest. So it's the combination of all these things together that has to do with whether the theater and the entertainment portion of your podcast is going to help drive it to new levels of success.
Right. Moving on to number 3. Frequency. I see this as a pretty big issue with some of the podcast shows that I listen to and explore. And, either they don't commit to episodes, right? They're putting out an episode, on a as it happens kind of basis versus a regular schedule, or they don't, or once a month or once every 6 weeks or all of that. And I think that is a big problem in attracting an audience. This sort of, lack of devotion to every week or every other week commitment, which is what I think it takes to really build a following for a podcast show. Once a month to me is just not going to cut it.
Yeah, I think this has to do with the last point about getting a relationship with a listener. And that comes through consistency. You also build trust by doing that. That's the interesting part. When you can trust that you're going to get a new episode of the program like once a week, then you like that just accelerates the relational benefit. I mean, from other shows that I've seen, I don't know any podcast that's really hit its stride in less than say 10 to 12 episodes. You're finding your footing. I mean, no, unless you're a celebrity, especially, like a voice celebrity, you're probably not the best host to begin with. So it takes some reps. It takes some time. And you're right. I don't know if everyone factors that in and they give up after, 6 to 8 episodes and they're like, well, how come, I don't have the following that I expected. It's like anything. I mean, any musician starts with an audience of zero, with 0 followers. You have to build it kind of like one gig at a time as a musician would. So just knowing that there is kind of like that, I'd say 10 to 12 episodes at a minimum to hit your stride and recognize that you got to put in your reps.
Yeah. If you get an audio content, you start driving down this lane, you just can't take the exit after, the first couple, just because you don't see that, you got the plays that you expected, which I think brings us to our next topic, which is the ROI of a podcast, which is usually for many shows, difficult to determine the ROI, number one, but number two, for a lot of people, companies, especially that start down this road, there is sort of perhaps a disappointment that occurs when they don't get the listeners or the plays that they thought they were going to get, and they where is the ROI here? It's an ungated asset. I'm not collecting leads. What is the payoff for perhaps putting in the mental bandwidth, which is what that really is, to do a podcast every week or every other week. But it's like anything, it takes time and effort to build loyalty, to expose the host to a listening audience that you're trying to reach, to get those listeners to relate to that host, what we just we're talking about previously. And then, of course, like anything, the ROI means something different, perhaps to one person or one podcast show or one company behind that show than it does to somebody else.
Right. I think we dove into this a little bit last time where we talked about the fact that there isn't an audio tracking pixel, as you would say, right. The way that we can measure a ROI in a lot of written content is because there are tracking pixels. The thought about it is that, understand what it does. For me, a podcast is a way to indirectly provide value. I can say right now, 100% of my consulting clients have come from word of mouth, from people who have they're either familiar with the podcast, they're a listener, or they've been a previous guest. And so there's a relationship there, one way or the other. And right. It's indirect. I don't tell people even most of what I actually do, on the podcast. That's not my place to do it. I'm trying to provide valuable thought leadership. And so in that way, my ROI is providing better loyalty, engagement, relevance, and trust for my brand. And so knowing that, I'm measuring that in the strength of relationships and the value that I know I provide to guests.
So our next topic. So you know me well enough to know that I am a big, voice marketing. I'm on the voice marketing march. I talk to all my clients about this, and the idea being that audio content falls under the umbrella of voice marketing, and podcasts, of course, fall under the sub umbrella of audio content. And so, as a podcast show, as a host, you have to be thinking about from a voice content and a voice marketing, how various technologies are engaged for your particular podcast. And so, you have to think about, how does Google find my show? Right? Or if I say, hey, Alexa, play the podcast show, blah, 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 will it start streaming the latest episode of my show? So there are voice-enabled technologies that you must take into play as you push out your podcast. It's just not good enough, I don't think, to say, I use SoundCloud to host my my podcast. I've submitted my podcast into the 20 biggest networks. Now go that extra step and figure out how are listeners going to find your content through these voice-enabled technologies. And when they do find it, how does it sound?
Yes, I think this is the most, out of everything, this is the most exciting part about audio content, Carol, for that exact reason, is that voice content will continue to grow as a category, and to realize the connection between them, like you mentioned. I think it's worth, pointing out things like when I'm on my iPhone now and I just swipe left to Apple News, I don't even read the stories there, but there's an audio like story of the day, basically, so even things like my iPhone, Apple News has an audio version. It's like a 9-minute version of the story today, at least. It's usually somewhere between like 7 and 9 minutes, but there's audio content that's even being provided by my phone. So
right.
Like there are those who understand this and are putting out content and are learning the nuances of it. And so the kind of the tactical part of it for me is that if you do have a podcast out there with whatever hosting platform you've got, depending on what level you have, some of them make this easier than not, but make sure you've submitted to TuneIn, because that submits, at least right now, it'll change at some point, I'm sure. That's one way, an easy way to get it playing on Amazon devices, on Alexa.
Right. Their agreement is with TuneIn. Right. Exactly. And so, and you also point to, that Apple, that Apple News audio content, that's, similar to what Amazon does with their Alexa smart speaker, with their Amazon Flash briefings. It's the same sort of thing, right? And so people, companies and marketers are recognizing that, as I say, getting away from tap, 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 tap to voice, right? That you're asking Siri and Alexa and Google questions to find particular content. So make sure with your podcast show that they can find you. So my next topic is what it's like my Marsha. I might be dating myself with the Brady Bunch reference here, but it's analytics. And so just universally, everyone that I talk to, and you probably maybe experience the same things, understands that if you're hosting a podcast show, that the analytics is very minimal. Like you said, it's not like a Google Analytic where you can get specific amount of time that somebody's on a page reading a blog article. It's not like having HubSpot on your website where you can, track, where these eyeballs are moving. So the analytics are minimum. One of the things I want to share with anyone who hosts a podcast show is a free measurement tool called PodTrack. And PodTrack uses AIB standards, what they call the International Advertising Bureau standards. And IAB has gotten involved now, of course, in podcasts because of sponsorship sales. So people are, companies are buying commercials, pre-roll, mid-roll, and post-roll commercials on podcasts. And so IAB, which sort of monitors and sort of puts out these guidelines for companies who are buying ads or agencies that are buying ads, as to what this means from a podcast standpoint. And so they've got a couple different things that you do. Number one, they will measure for your show which networks get you the most traffic. So for example, for our Healthcare Now Radio network, and we of course have lots of shows, over 30 shows that go to podcasts or existing podcast shows. And we found out over a month of tracking that about 70% universally listen to our podcast on Healthcare Now Radio on Apple, right? Super interesting content, right? Or super interesting thing to know about your traffic, right? It's really where you're getting it. And so we were looking at it and going, we want to get more listeners perhaps on Spotify or on our Audible page. You can put your podcast on Audible. And so we started doing a campaign to see if we could move the number to, a different, for those people who don't maybe have an iPhone, but they're on Audible or they're on Amazon or whatnot. So that was really valuable. And the other thing that PodTrack can do is it will tell you the unique listener. So this is a big thing in International Advertising Bureau and IAB, much like Google talks in terms of unique visitors to your website. This will track unique listeners so that you understand, if I had 200 plays of a particular episode over this particular week or this particular month, how many of those plays were unique, right? Or versus people that came back and listened to it or started it and stopped it. The other thing that PodTrack does, again, as part of IAB measurement, is they actually specifically identify and define a download and a play are the same thing, which you and I know, but it will only track if somebody listens for 60 seconds or longer. So that, kind of avoids people who are just kind of clicking through or listen for, 10 seconds and then leave. So that is my my tip for analytics, right? Is that if you're a podcaster, go to PodTrack, PodTrac.com. It's a free tool you can download. You just give them your RSS feed, fill out the form, and they will start tracking.
There is another site called listennotes.com, like the two words listen notes.
Right.
And it gives you an interesting ranking. It gives you a ranking for your show that it says they have their own unique algorithm. So they do factor in the number of listens based on Chartable. So there's another one, Chartable, just to see, that's just for overall listens to your show. But listennotes.com also gives you a ranking that they say takes into consideration like your ranking, your ratings and reviews, and a couple of other pieces of information. And so it gives you a score, and then it says where that score ranks globally. So like as in the top 50%, top 20% and whatnot. And that's actually a decent way, just another way I'd say to augment your analytics. In and of itself, it's because there's an algorithm involved that they don't exactly explain to you. It is subjective, but that has actually been really useful for a couple of shows I produce.
Yeah. And of course, there's a big difference between, if you're in the B2B space versus B2C and what your focus is. I mean, obviously, we're in healthcare on the B2B side, so we've kind of, gone down this very niche road. But again, there are things that, you've got, like you said, it's not apples to apples, but, everybody wants to be measured. Content marketers obviously want to measure themselves against, a pool. And these all these sites will kind of give you that, right? We'll give you, oh gosh, these are things that we can do to improve. But let's see how we stack up against everybody else. So we talked about quality in our three-legged stool as our first point, but now I'd like to dig a little bit in the weeds here and talk about the technical part of sound. I fessed up. I use a noise canceling headset plugged into my computer that was like $50 in Amazon. But I'm going to have you weigh in here because you produce a lot of podcasts for a lot of different companies, and I know that this is near and dear to my heart. But this is part of your what you do for companies is really related to the sound quality and editing.
Sure. So a couple of thoughts. I mean, first off, in terms of what I'd consider professional enough audio quality, right? So this is for those who do not have a studio built into your house or your workplace, for those who are, this is not a core operation enough to invest thousands of dollars into equipment and things. The good news is you don't have to do that. For the vast majority of us, you don't have to do that. There are a couple of things to keep in mind. There are some basic levels of microphones, but the quality and the cost and the access of those is considerably lower than it was even a number of years ago. The type of microphone, I think the Blue Yeti microphone family is a standard out there, and those usually range anywhere from 120 to $180 maybe for any of them that sound as good as most professional level microphones for a podcast. We're not recording intricate musical arrangements. It's voice and sound. So, there are a few basics there, but yeah, you don't have to spend $1,000 on a microphone. And then, as far as editing goes, I am kind of a stickler with that, I guess. I do like to think that makes a difference. And if you haven't noticed, I don't say things perfectly the first time. I usually go back and I say certain things a lot. And if I point them out, then you're going to notice them every time I say them. So I don't want to say exactly what those things are, but I catch them all the time from myself. And I remember the first year that I was podcasting, I kept saying, so many times. I had to consciously filter it out before I started saying the next word out of my mouth. I would say it like every other word. And I just had to be careful with that. So I spent so much time editing the actual program, trying to get those ums and uhs, kind of those pauses out of it because it was distracting.
So our next topic, as we're winding down here on topic number 8, is why podcast listening is growing. And I talk to companies and podcasters about this quite a bit. And I'm going to harken back to late 2016 or maybe summer of 2016, when the iPhone version that year came out with an Apple podcast icon right there. You didn't have to find it. You didn't have to download it. It was right there front and center. And so both and Android followed suit in that same time frame. So all of a sudden people were buying these smartphones with these podcast icon on it. And they really began to explore podcast listening. And this is borne out by the Infinite Dial, which is research that you and I look at every March. It comes out by Edison. It's called the Infinite Dial. You can Google it and find it. And they've been tracking the growth of podcast listening for many years now. And you see pretty obviously what happened in 2016 with the smartphone. And podcast listening has never gone back. And according to the Infinite Dial, the research that came out in March of 2021, there's no let up according to what they see in podcast consumption. There's no let up from now until at least 2025, as far as they can see. You read the same things that I do.
Yeah, for sure. I think it all comes back to just the simple fact that this is the one type of content medium that you can multitask while you consume the content. And in everyday life, that makes a big difference. You can listen to something while you're on the treadmill, while you're in the backyard, while you are doing other chores, while you are actually doing other work. There's just this simple fact, and it's one that gets overlooked again all the time. And I keep coming back to that because I don't see any end to that growth either as a result of that. When people find a podcast or any other type of audio content that they like, it might even be that audio feed from Apple News, right? It can be from any source. It can be from a flash briefing, like you said, on your Alexa device. It doesn't matter what it is. The fact is, once you find it, you tend to stick with it because you've found a way to get more time out of the day. It makes you feel more productive. And you're learning something at the same time. So I just think there's that piece, that lifestyle piece of it that will always cause more growth.
Right. Number 9, repurposing a podcast. I talk to some of our clients who they don't think about this, but it is a piece of content, right? And it is diceable, I guess, for lack of a better term. So you can repurpose podcasts. And you do a lot in this arena. And I love it when you say, your mantra is, from a single episode of a podcast, you usually get 5 to 7 pieces. I mean, that's amazing. So tell our audience a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, I think I kind of took it to the extreme by turning my first podcast into a book. And
that's one, but that's one way.
that is one way to do it, which don't be surprised if I do that again at some point, just FYI. I think from my web days, which was kind of the beginning of my, my digital marketing career, was producing web content and websites and developing them, I realized that no two people really experience a website the same way. And so no two people really experience your content the same way. Some people just skim. Some people are the deep readers. They read everything. Some people just want to find their one single headline. That's all they need. And some people are always going to want their thing on a website. They want that at the very top of the menu. Some people want something else on the top of the menu. So you have to do your best to accommodate different styles. And it's the same thing with your content. Think of your podcast as, yes, you're going to have a core listenership for those who are subscribed and listening every week and listen to the whole episode and share it. You're going to have those kind of those super fans, those super listeners, and you should play that up. And you should hope for enough of those that it makes up for other areas. But then there are those who would get something out of one little piece, one little takeaway, one or two sentences, 1 minute's worth. And how do you reach them? Well, you pull those things out, you turn it into a quote card, an image that you post as a separate post with a link to the full episode. You create an audiogram, which is the waveform videos that are little snippets. They're usually captioned at the bottom. So if you're just scrolling through a feed with your sound off, which most of us do, then you're still getting something out of it. Even passing, you're like, oh yeah, they had Carol on, and Carol said that thing. That's really cool, So it's just that recognition that kind of drives me to create a lot more content out of it. Because the other problem that solves is when you're looking back, this kind of comes back to the ROI side of things, of when you're looking at, was this investment of time and money worth it?
Right.
And you're like, well, we have this mountain of content that was sitting there that if people didn't experience, that episode that week, then they didn't hear it. And there are people that just are going to miss certain parts of it. And I don't want that to happen because I thought that part was really good. So I'm going to find another way to repurpose it. So it's a lot like, a musician and, our favorite music groups, that there are those who are just going to go out there and wait till their careers are basically in decline, and you're going to go buy the greatest hits album. And there are those who follow every album and go on tour. They go see them on concerts and know the deep cuts on the album. But then there are a lot who just buy the greatest hits. So go create that greatest hits album. Go pull the favorite parts. It doesn't have to be a book. That, like I said, that's kind of an extreme example. But recognize how much more value you can get out of the content that you're creating in other formats.
So number 10, last, my favorite topic, and hopefully yours too, since we're both in the world of marketing, is marketing. Sort of leading into that in the sense of once you've got episodes, once you've got 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 episodes, a body of work, right? Not just 2 songs, but an album's worth of songs, right? Now you really do have to start putting some marketing effort into that. And maybe that involves spending money, or maybe it doesn't. But the reality is you just don't want to let your podcast be that one-time play that happens on a particular network, right? The obvious includes, of course, you're going to let your newsletter people know that a new episode has come out, right? You're going to obviously share it on Twitter. You're going to share it in social media. But then again, there are things that you can do coming back later to draw attention to previous episodes. Again, in case you missed it, find another angle to do a piece of content. You work with P3 on the Paradigm Shift of Healthcare, who do these great 3-part series, and so that is a great way to shine a light on these previous episodes as you're building in this new episode, because now you've taken a topic and you divided it into 3 different episodes. So as you're going along and ticking along for each episode, you're remarketing the previous episodes that you did, right? It's brilliant, right? You can take all of the episodes you've put together, and like you said, you can create an ebook, or you can create a white paper that you can put on your website that can be downloaded and gated. So you have to think beyond, as a podcast show and as a host, or if you're the company behind, content marketer and a company behind that show and that host, think outside of this is not just a podcast. This is a reflection on the company. This is a piece of content, just like it is a webinar, an article, a speaking engagement. All of that needs to be marketed appropriately.
Agreed. It's one of the parts that just gets left out of the equation too much, because we're so excited to get the podcast out there into the world, and we just think that it's going to happen naturally, which it does, but just probably slower than most people think, especially if you do come from the B2B or marketing space, especially. We're used to seeing a whole bunch of impressions, or, a lot of reach for other things we put out there for ads. And so this is a lot different. You don't want to compare that way. What you want to realize is that, first and foremost, you do need to promote each episode. You need to promote people subscribing to it. And you can say subscribe on your favorite platform.
Right.
There's a lot, you're going to want to, you need a website. Most hosting platforms actually offer like a landing page of some kind that has an archive of all your episodes that you can go back and listen to. So you need to think about where you're pointing people with your promotions. And like you said, that can be organic or that can be paid or it can be both. There is some benefit to that though, promoting each episode. A rule of thumb that I've heard that I probably need to get better at, admittedly, is for each episode, you promote it 3 times the week that it comes out, then the next week 2 times, and then the following week 1 more time. It just, you're gonna get some residual listeners each time.
Well, we're just about out of time, and we're out of topic. Actually, we're never out of topic ideas, but we've gone through our 10 anyway. So I so appreciate you coming on with my tagline. I love doing this crossover podcast with you, and hopefully we'll do another one in our future.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me back.
You can learn more about Jared Johnson at his website, shift.health. And be sure to check out his podcast, Healthcare Wrap, on your favorite platform. Have a guest or topic suggestion for this show? Send me an email at carol@healthcarenowradio.com or message me on Twitter at Carol Flagg or on LinkedIn. Until then, I want to know, what's your tagline?